manage ADDS operations masters. ADDS uses a multiple master process to copy data between domain controllers and automatically implements a conflict resolution algorithm that remediates simultaneous conflicting updates. These provisions allow for a distributed management model where multiple users and applications can concurrently apply changes to ADDS objects on different domain controllers. Such a model is necessary to support any ADDS environment with 2 or more domain controllers. However, it's critical for larger distributed environments such as Contosos. It's important to remember, though, that certain operations can be performed only by a specific role on a specific domain controller. What are ADDS operations masters? ADDS operation master roles are responsible for performing operations that aren't suitable for a multiple master model. A domain controller that has one of these roles is an operations master. An operations master role is also known as a flexible single master operation, FSMO role. There are 5 operations master roles: schema master, domain naming master, infrastructure master, RID master, PDC emulator master. By default, the first domain controller installed in a forest hosts all 5 roles. However, you can transfer these roles after deploying additional domain controllers. When performing operations master-specific changes, you must connect to the domain controller with the role. The 5 operations master roles have the following distribution. Each forest has 1 schema master and 1 domain naming master. Each ADDS domain has 1 relative ID, RID master, 1 infrastructure master, and 1 primary domain controller, PDC emulator. You can place all 5 on a single domain controller or distribute them across several domain controllers. Forest operations masters. A forest has the following operations master roles. Domain naming master. This is the domain controller that you must contact when you add or remove a domain or make domain name changes. Important: if the domain naming master is unavailable, you won't be able to add domains to the forest. Schema master. This is the domain controller in which you make all schema changes. Important: if the schema master is unavailable, you won't be able to make changes to the schema. Note: the Windows PowerShell command get-ad-forest from the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell displays the forest properties, including the current domain naming master and schema master. Domain operations masters. A domain has the following operations master roles. RID master. Whenever you create a security principal such as a user, computer, or group in ADDS, the domain controller where you created the object assigns the object a unique identifying number known as a security ID, SID. To ensure that no 2 domain controllers assign the same SID to 2 different objects, the RID master allocates blocks of RIDs to each domain controller within the domain to use when building SIDs. Important: if the RID master is unavailable, you might experience difficulties adding security principals to the domain. Also, as domain controllers use their existing RIDs, they eventually run out of them and are unable to create new objects. Infrastructure master. This role maintains interdomain object references, such as when a group in one domain has a member from another domain. In this situation, the infrastructure master manages maintaining the integrity of this reference. For example, when you review an object's security tab, the system references the listed SIDs and translates them into names. In a multiple domain forest, the infrastructure master updates references to SIDs from other domains with the corresponding security principal names. Important: if the infrastructure master is unavailable, domain controllers that aren't global catalogs won't be able to perform translation of SIDs' security principal names. Important: the infrastructure master role shouldn't reside on the domain controller that's hosting the global catalog role unless every domain controller in the forest is configured to serve as a global catalog. In this case, the infrastructure master role isn't necessary because every domain controller knows about every object in the forest. PDC emulator master. The domain controller that is the PDC emulator master serves as the time source for the domain. The PDC emulator master in each domain in a forest synchronizes their time with the PDC emulator master in the forest root domain. You set the PDC emulator master in the forest root domain to synchronize with a reliable external time source. Additionally, by default, changes to group policy objects, GPOs, are by default written to the PDC emulator master. The PDC emulator master is also the domain controller that receives urgent password changes. If a user's password changes, the domain controller with the PDC emulator master role receives this information immediately. This means that if the user tries to sign in, the domain controller in the user's current location contacts the domain controller with the PDC emulator master role to check for recent changes. This occurs even if a domain controller in a different location that hadn't yet received the new password information authenticated the user. Important: if the PDC emulator master is unavailable, users might have trouble signing in until their password changes have replicated to all the domain controllers. Note: the Windows PowerShell command get_add_domain from the Active Directory module for Windows PowerShell displays the domain properties, including the current RID master, infrastructure master, and PDC emulator master. Manage ADDS operations masters. In an ADDS environment where you distribute operations master roles among domain controllers, you might need to move a role from one domain controller to another. When you perform a move in a planned manner between two online domain controllers, the move is known as transferring the role. In emergencies, if the current role holder isn't available, the move is known as seizing the role. When you transfer a role, the latest data from the domain controller in that role replicates to the target server. Important: you should seize a role only as a last resort when there's no chance for recovering the current role holder. Transfer operations master roles. You can transfer operations master roles by using the ADDS snap-ins that the following table lists. Role, snap-in, schema master, Active Directory schema, domain naming master, Active Directory domains and trusts, infrastructure master, Active Directory users and computers, RID master, Active Directory users and computers, PDC emulator master, Active Directory users and computers, seize operations master roles. You cannot use ADDS snap-ins to seize operations master roles. Instead, you must use either the ntd_sutl.exe command line tool or Windows PowerShell to seize roles. Note: you can also use these tools to transfer roles. The syntax for transferring a role and seizing a role is similar within Windows PowerShell, as the following syntax line demonstrates. For the preceding syntax, the noteworthy definitions are as follows: server name, the name of the target domain controller to which you're transferring one or more roles. Role name list, a comma-separated list of ADDS role names to move to the target server. Force, an optional parameter that you include to seize a role instead of transferring it. Demonstration. The following video demonstrates how to identify placement of operations master roles. Transfer operations master roles between domain controllers. The main steps in the process are: 1. Create ADDS environment. Create a single domain ADDS forest containing 2 domain controllers. 2. Check the placement of operations master roles. Identify which of the 2 domain controllers hosts the operations master roles. 3. Transfer operations master roles between domain controllers by using the GUI tools. Use the GUI tools to transfer the operations master's roles from the domain controller you identified in the previous step to the other one. 4. Transfer operations master roles between domain controllers by using command line tools. Use the command line tools to transfer the operations master's roles back to the first
the flexible single master operations, or FSMO roles, from one domain controller to another. So before we start the demo, there are 2 domain controllers in this environment, SEA DC1 and SEA SVR1. Let's get started. So the first thing I do is I run from a PowerShell session the netdom query FSMO command. And in running that command, I can see where all of the FSMO roles lie. And you can see here that all of them are sitting on SEA DC1. So I clear the PowerShell screen, and what I do is I register the schema management DLL with the operating system. This is necessary to use the schema management console. I open up the Microsoft Management Console, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the schema management snap-in. So I click OK. I right-click on Active Directory Schema, and then I change the active server. Here, I type in SEA SVR1. It resolves that server. I select it. I click OK. Now, the reason I'm doing this is that I need to connect to the server that I wish to transfer the role to make this transfer operation. So now that I've connected to SEA SVR1, I can right-click on Active Directory Schema, select Operations Master, and I can see the current schema master is SEA DC1, and then the Active Directory domain controller that I've connected to, SEA SVR1, is my option for moving that role. So I click Change, and this changes the schema master operations role. I click Close. Okay, so that's the first role we've transferred. Let's move another one. I open Administrative Tools. I move to Active Directory Domains and Trust, and I do the same operation here. I change my Active Domain Controller and say go and connect to SEA SVR1. And when I do that and click OK, SEA SVR1 becomes the domain controller I'm connected to with this console. And then I can select the Operations Master item. And this allows me to move the domain naming Operations Master from SEA DC1 to SEA SVR1. So I click Change, and that Operations Master role is moved. The next console I open is Active Directory Users and Computers, and I'm going to use this console to change the last 3 Operations Master roles. So Active Directory Users and Computers opens. I select Change Domain Controller. I again make sure that I am connected to SEA SVR1. I click OK. Now that I've got a connection to that particular domain controller with this console, I can go to Operations Master, and this gives me a dialog box that allows me to move the RID master, the PDC emulator, and the infrastructure master. And it's the same basic process. So all I need to do is on the RID page, click Change, and it moves the RID across. I can select the PDC emulator, click Change, click Yes, and that'll move that role across. And I can select the infrastructure master, click Change, and click Yes, and that will move that role across. I click Close, I open up my management console, I clear the screen, and then I go back and run that netdom query FSMA roles, and I see that they're all now sitting on SEA SVR1 because I've transferred them to that domain controller. Now, as you are probably quite aware, there's a multitude of ways that you can actually transfer your FSMA roles. You can use PowerShell, which we're not going to show you here, or you can also use the NTDS utility. This is a slightly older way of performing this operation, but it's still supported. So we select roles, we connect to server SEA DC1. Once we've done that, we enter FSMA role maintenance and we transfer the schema master. And what we're doing here is we're transferring this role back from SEA SVR1 to SEA DC1. Remember when we did it with the console, what we did is we connected to the server that we wanted to transfer to, and then we made the transfer. So as these are all sitting on SVR1, we're pushing them back to DC1. So next, we use the command transfer naming master. Hit enter, click yes, and we've moved that one across. Now we're moving RID master. We click yes. We transfer the infrastructure master. We click yes. And then we transfer the PDC emulator. Click yes. We quit because we've moved all the roles. We quit again. We clear the screen, and then we do our netdom query, and we verify that everything has been moved back to SEA DC1. So in that demonstration, you saw how to transfer FSMA roles using consoles and using NTDS utility.